You can stay down here until the evening is over. The door is locked. Don't worry, nothing will happen to you. Those were the words spoken to me on my birthday, in the basement of a house I had paid for with my own money. The concrete floor was cold through my shoes. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paint. I heard the door close, then the sharp, final click of the lock. I stood there for a moment, not moving, listening to footsteps retreat upstairs. On a small folding table beside the furnace lay a single sheet of paper. April 14th. A total of $186,400. And at the bottom, a signature that looked like mine, but wasn't. I knew my own handwriting. I had never signed that document. That was the moment I understood something I had never imagined in my life. My daughter-in-law had turned me into a prisoner in my own home. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear my full story, stay with me because what happened next changed my life forever. My name is Margaret Lewis. I was 68 years old when that basement door closed behind me, though I did not feel old until that day. I had worked for 35 years without missing more than a handful of mornings. I paid my taxes on time, balanced my accounts by hand, and kept every important paper in neat, labeled folders. I was the woman people came to when they needed something done carefully and quietly. I raised my children to believe that family meant showing up, even when it was inconvenient. Especially then. My husband and I lived by that rule. When he died, suddenly and without warning, the house in Santa Rosa felt too large and too silent. I sold it a year later. The sale left me comfortable, not wealthy, but secure enough that I could have chosen my own small place and lived independently for the rest of my life. That was my plan. Then my son started calling more often. He said the nights worried him. He said he didn't like the idea of me alone. You took care of us, he told me, his voice warm and familiar. Now it's our turn. We're family. I wanted to believe that love could look like that. I wanted to believe I was still needed, not merely remembered. They had just bought a house, larger than they could easily manage. My son said it would be better if I invested instead of renting somewhere else. He said it would keep everything simple. I agreed to put most of the money from my home into theirs, trusting that paperwork could always be adjusted later. We shook hands at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling between us. No one raised their voice. No one rushed me. That should have reassured me. It did. When I moved in, I brought only what mattered. A single suitcase of clothes. My blue scarf. A framed photograph of my husband smiling beside a lemon tree. I told myself this was not the end of my independence, only a new chapter. I told myself that love, once given, would be returned in kind. For a little while, it was. Meals together. Polite conversation. Doors left open. I ignored the small unease that settled in my chest, the sense that something had shifted before I was ready to name it. I had trusted my instincts my entire life. That was the first time I set them aside. For the first few weeks, I tried to be easy to live with. I woke before anyone else, rinsed my mug, and kept my things in the bedroom they'd given me small, tidy, and a little too bright in the mornings. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself that grief made me sensitive, and that I shouldn't read meanings into ordinary household noise, cabinet doors, hurried footsteps, the television turned up before sunrise. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was the gentle kind of erasing, the sort you can mistake for a misunderstanding. My daughter-in-law, Claire, would smile and say, "Oh, I moved that for now," as if my belongings were temporary visitors. My blue scarf disappeared from the hook by the back door. My photo of my husband migrated from the mantel to a shelf in the hallway, half hidden behind a vase. I noticed. I simply didn't comment. I kept my voice mild and my hands busy. I folded towels the way I always had, edges aligned. I wiped the counters until they shone. I offered to pick up groceries. I thought if I made myself useful, I would stay visible. One Saturday, I made oatmeal the way I always had, slow, with cinnamon and sliced apples. The kitchen smelled like home for a brief minute. Claire came in, glanced at the pot, and opened the pantry with a sharp little sigh. "We don't really do that here," she said. I laughed softly, as if it were a joke. "Oatmeal." She looked at me the way people look at a stain they hadn't expected to see. Then she said it, casual as weather, almost sweet. In our family, we do things differently. It shouldn't have mattered. It was one sentence. But it landed in me with a dull weight, because it wasn't about breakfast. It was about belonging. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't a mother being welcomed. I was a guest being managed. After that, the rules arrived without being announced. The laundry room worked best on certain days. The living room was busy when her friends came over. The guest bathroom became the one we keep for company, which meant I should use the small one near the garage. When I turned the thermostat up one notch, it was quietly turned down again. When I left a book on the coffee table, it reappeared on my bed like a returned item. Small things. But they add up the way pennies do quietly, until you suddenly feel the weight in your purse. The first time I realized I was no longer being included, it was over dinner. Claire set the table with 3 plates. I stood there holding a bowl of salad, waiting for the 4th. "Oh," she said, without looking up. "I thought you might eat later. We're just doing something quick." My son didn't meet my eyes. He took his seat, phone in hand, and said, "Mom, you're fine, right? Long day." I was fine. I was always fine. I carried my bowl to the counter and ate standing up, listening to their forks scrape against porcelain. Soon I stopped being told when guests were coming. I'd walk into the kitchen in my slippers and find people I didn't know leaning against my counters, laughing as if they'd always been there. Claire would say, "This is Margaret, the way you introduce a neighbor." Then she'd switch topics, and the conversation would slide around me like water. My mail began arriving in a neat stack on Claire's desk instead of the basket by the door. "I'm keeping it all together," she said, tapping the pile with one polished fingernail. "It's easier." "Easier for who?" I asked, meaning it lightly. She smiled. "For everyone." When the bank sent a new debit card after the old one expired, I didn't see it. When I asked, Claire said, "Oh, it came." I put it somewhere safe. Safe. A word that started to mean, "not with you." My son tried to smooth it over as if I were imagining shadows. When I mentioned the missing card, he said, "Claire's just organized, Mom." When I asked where my old checkbook had gone, he said, "We don't really use checks anymore." When I suggested I could pay my portion of utilities, he said, "Don't worry about it. We've got it." One evening, I overheard Claire in the hallway, speaking in a low voice I hadn't heard from her before. "No, she doesn't need to handle it," she said. "It just confuses her." I stood still behind my bedroom door, my hand on the knob, listening to the hush and the certainty in her tone. Confuses her. As if I were already someone who needed to be managed. At night, I lay in bed listening to the hum of the refrigerator through the wall. Sometimes I heard a drawer close in Claire's office, then the soft beep of her phone. It sounded like decisions being made without me. Ever. I held my blue scarf in my hands like a piece of proof. I told myself families adjust. Still, I began to keep quiet records in my old habit, dates in a small notebook, little shifts I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what I was preparing for. I only knew I could feel myself becoming lighter in that house, as if I were being slowly moved out of my own life. The house slowly taught me how little space I was allowed to take. It was never announced. There was no argument, no raised voice, no single moment I could point to and say, "This is where it changed." Instead, it arrived like winter, 1 degree at a time. I stopped being told when people were coming over. I would come upstairs in the afternoon and find coats on the chair and unfamiliar shoes by the door. Conversations would pause just long enough for someone to glance at me, then resume without explanation. Claire would smile tightly and say, "Oh, we didn't think you'd be up," even when it was 3 o'clock. My belongings began to migrate. First the small things, my sewing kit, my extra blanket, the ceramic bowl I'd brought from Santa Rosa. "Just for now," Claire said, stacking them neatly into boxes. "We need the space." The boxes were moved into the garage, then out of sight entirely. When I asked where they'd gone, she said, "They're safe. You don't need them anyway." Even the kitchen was no longer mine. I was told which shelves I could use, which pans were better left where they were. I learned to wait until Claire finished cooking before making tea. When I turned on the television in the afternoon, she would pass through the room and lower the volume without comment. If I adjusted it back, it was lowered again later, as if by an unseen hand. Laundry became scheduled. So did showers. So did phone calls. Once, when my sister rang, Claire stood in the doorway listening until I finished. Afterward, she said, "You don't need to share family business." Her tone was calm, almost kind, but her eyes were watchful. I began to feel as though I were shrinking. I took up less space at the table. I spoke more softly. I stopped asking questions that made my son uncomfortable. He had developed a way of looking past me, his attention always sliding back to his phone, to Claire, to whatever required less effort than acknowledging what was happening. I reminded myself that this was temporary, that families had growing pains, that if I waited, things would settle. But every day, another small permission was revoked. I was told when to eat, when to rest, when to leave the room. Once, when I stayed too long in the living room, Claire said, "We need privacy," as if I were a stranger who had wandered in uninvited. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. The hum of the refrigerator. The click of a phone charging in the next room. I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, except I had paid for the walls around me. I still told myself I was imagining it. I still believed that love meant patience. But somewhere inside me, a quiet unease took root, and it did not leave. That evening, my birthday arrived quietly. No card on the table. No mention of candles or cake. Claire said they were busy, that we would celebrate another time. I told her it was fine. I had learned by then how easily my feelings could be dismissed, and how much simpler the days became when I asked for nothing. Just before dinner, my son appeared in the doorway of my room. He didn't sit down. He didn't smile. He said the boiler had been making a noise and asked if I would come look at it with him, since I knew those things. I followed him downstairs without thinking. The basement light flickered on, throwing long shadows against the concrete walls. The moment I stepped inside, he hesitated. That was when I heard Claire's voice behind me. Calm. Almost gentle. "You can stay down here until the evening is over," she said. "The door is locked. Don't worry, nothing will happen to you." The door closed. The lock clicked. At first, I stood still, waiting for laughter, for a correction, for someone to say this was a mistake. None came. I walked to the door and tried the handle. It didn't move. The cold seeped up through my shoes. My breath sounded loud in the small space. That was when I noticed the table. A single sheet of paper lay there, weighted with a wrench. I picked it up with careful fingers. It was dated April 14th. The amount was printed clearly, $186,400. Below it was a signature meant to be mine. The letters slanted wrong. The pressure was unfamiliar. I had signed my name thousands of times. This was not it. Beside it were bank statements. Month after month. Transfers of sometimes $5,000. Always to the same fund. A name I had never heard of. I sat down on the step and read every line, the way I once read my children's report cards, slowly and with attention. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't help. It was planning. From upstairs, voices drifted down through the vents. Claire speaking in short, efficient phrases. My son answering softly. Words like facility, paperwork, after. They spoke as if I were already gone. In that basement, on my birthday, I understood the truth. I wasn't being protected. I was being removed. I don't remember how long I sat there at first. Time behaved strangely in that basement. Without a window, without a clock, minutes stretched and folded into themselves. I remember the cold pressing through my coat and the steady tick of the old furnace, a sound I had heard for months and never truly listened to. It felt louder now, like something counting for me. I did not scream. That surprised me. I had always thought fear announced itself loudly, with pounding and panic and noise. Instead, what came over me was quiet. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing slowed. Something inside me settled, the way snow settles after a storm, covering sharp edges. I replayed everything in my mind, carefully, the way I used to balance my checkbook. The missing mail. The vanished debit card. The organization. The words spoken about me when they thought I couldn't hear. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been for my benefit. It formed a shape now, clear and undeniable. They had counted on my silence. They had counted on my politeness, on my habit of not wanting to make trouble, on my belief that family always meant safety. They had mistaken patience for weakness. And in that basement, I finally understood that waiting would not save me. Trust would not save me. Only clarity would. I stood up and walked the length of the room, testing my legs, my balance, my resolve. I touched the wall, the cold concrete solid beneath my palm. I was still here. I was still myself. They had locked a door, not erased me. I thought of my blue scarf, folded neatly in a drawer upstairs. I thought of the notebook where I had written dates and small observations, not knowing why I felt compelled to do so. I thought of my daughter, the one I had been gently discouraged from calling too often. "She's busy," Claire had said. "You don't want to worry her." I had listened. I would not listen anymore. Sitting back down, I smoothed the papers on the table and read them again, slowly. I memorized the figures. I noted the account names. I took in every detail, because details were how I had survived my whole life. They were how I had raised children, built a career, kept a household running. That woman was still here. When the fear finally came, it was brief. Sharp, then gone. It was replaced by something steadier, resolve. I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this would be the last decision made without my consent. Whatever happened next, it would happen with my eyes open. In that basement, on my birthday, I chose to live as if my life still belonged to me. I knew the only thing more dangerous than that locked door was what would happen when it opened. If I walked upstairs empty-handed, with no plan, they would simply tighten the net. So I did what I had always done in a crisis. I made a list in my head and followed it, step by step, without emotion. My phone was in my pocket. Claire had stopped me from keeping it at the table. "Screens ruin dinner," she liked to say, but she hadn't thought to take it from me at the basement door. I held it close to my body and turned the screen away from the stairs, as if the walls themselves might report me. There was only one person I trusted completely, and it was the person they had worked hardest to keep at a distance. My daughter, Ellen. I called her once. It rang and rang. I called again. On the third ring she answered, breathless, as if she'd been running. "Mom?" Hearing her voice nearly broke the calm I'd gathered, but I kept it steady. "Ellen, listen to me. I'm in the basement. The door is locked. I'm not hurt, but I need you to come. Tonight." There was a pause, just a small inhale, then her tone changed. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm safe for the moment," I said. "They've been moving money. There are papers with my name on them that I didn't sign. I need you to come. Don't call my son first. Come yourself." "I'm leaving now," she said. No questions. No hesitation. Just action. It was the sound of the child I'd raised, grown into a woman who could carry weight. When I ended the call, my hands shook for the first time. I pressed them against my thighs until they steadied. Then I did the next practical thing. I opened my banking app. My passwords still worked. They hadn't expected me to remember them. I scrolled through transactions and took screenshots, amounts, dates, account numbers. 4,000. 5,000. Again and again. I emailed the images to Ellen with a subject line so plain it wouldn't draw attention. Statements. I found the setting to freeze my cards and turned it on. I changed the password. Then I changed it again to something no one could guess from birthdays or pet names. I added a note to myself in the phone, April 14th. $186,400. Forged signature. Upstairs, I heard laughter. Glasses clinking. Music starting. They were celebrating without me, already dividing what they believed was theirs. The cruelty of it did not make me loud. It made me careful. A knock came at the basement door an hour later. My son's voice softened into performance. "Mom? You okay down there? Claire thought you might want some quiet. We'll let you out soon." I didn't answer. I sat with my back against the wall, phone in my hand, and waited for the sound I needed most, Ellen's car pulling into the driveway. When it finally came, faint through the foundation, it felt like air returning to my lungs. I was not rescued by luck that night. I was rescued by a decision. The next sounds were quick: car doors, footsteps, a firm knock upstairs that didn't sound like a guest. Ellen's voice carried down the stairwell. Open the basement. Now. My son tried for a laugh. Ellen, it's fine. Mom wanted to check the boiler. She called me from down there, Ellen said. You locked her in. Open it. The lock turned. Light spilled down the steps. Ellen came first, steady. She took my hand. I'm here. Behind her was a woman who introduced herself as an attorney. Ellen had reached on the drive over, and another man with a notepad who stayed quiet and watchful. No shouting. No spectacle. Just witnesses. I lifted the paper from the table. That isn't my signature, I said. Claire stood at the top of the stairs, arms folded, voice smooth. Margaret gets confused. We were helping her manage things. The attorney looked from the date to the amount. Mrs. Lewis, she asked me, do you want anyone else signing or accessing your accounts? I looked at my son. He stared at the wall. I looked at Claire. No, I said. I don't. Upstairs, my birthday dinner sat half-finished on the table, wine glasses, a roast, candles, not for me. No cake. No card. I didn't comment. I simply asked for my purse, my identification, and my files. When Claire said they were kept safe, I answered, then you'll have no trouble giving them back. Within an hour, I was in Ellen's car, my blue scarf around my neck, a folder of papers on my lap. In her kitchen later, we printed the screenshots I'd sent from the basement and placed them behind a tab that read April 14th. We left messages for the bank and wrote down every account name and transfer amount. Ordinary actions, paper, ink, a steady hand, building a boundary they could not charm their way through. Before bed, I wrote one sentence in my notebook in the same careful handwriting they had tried to imitate. No more signatures without my full understanding. Then I slept, not because everything was fixed, but because I had started protecting myself. Consequences do not always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes they come quietly, like returned mail or a phone that no longer rings. In the days that followed, everything my son and Claire had arranged so carefully began to unravel, not because I demanded it loudly, but because truth does not need theatrics to stand. The bank froze the accounts within 48 hours. The transfers stopped mid-month. Automatic payments failed. I learned this not from notifications, but from the sound of tension in my son's voice when he finally called Ellen instead of me. His tone was different now, strained, uncertain, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Mom didn't mean to make things complicated, he said. We were just trying to help. Help, I learned, is a word people use when they want credit without consent. The attorney confirmed what Ellen and I already knew. The document dated April 14th was invalid. The signature was forged. The so-called fund was controlled by an account neither my name nor my authorization appeared on. Claire stopped attending calls once questions became specific. When she did speak, her words were careful, rehearsed, and useless. The house they believed they controlled suddenly felt smaller to them. Bills that had been quietly paid for my money were now their responsibility. A planned vacation was canceled. A car payment bounced. These were not punishments I designed. They were simply the absence of access. My son came to Ellen's house one afternoon alone. He did not ask to come in at first. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes tired. When I opened the door, he looked at me the way people look at someone they underestimated. I never thought it would go this far, he said. It went exactly as far as you let it, I answered. My voice was steady. I surprised myself with that. He asked for forgiveness, not once but several times, each attempt softer than the last. I listened. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I said, forgiveness is not the same as access. He nodded, though I could tell he did not fully understand. Other relatives stayed silent. Silence can be its own confession. I did not return to that house. Through proper channels, my investment was documented, disentangled, and reclaimed. It took weeks, not days. Paperwork instead of drama. Procedure instead of confrontation. I chose that path deliberately. I had learned what happened when others spoke for me. The hardest consequence was not theirs. It was mine. I had to accept that the family I believed in did not exist in the way I imagined. Letting go of that belief felt like setting down something heavy I had carried for years without noticing the strain. When the last document was signed by me, with my own pen, I closed my notebook and wrote one final line beneath April 14th. I chose myself. And for the first time, that choice did not feel lonely. Starting over did not feel dramatic. There were no sudden revelations, no sweeping gestures. It began with small, ordinary decisions made without fear. Ellen helped me find a modest apartment across town, quiet, with a window that caught the morning light just right. The lease was in my name alone. I read every line twice before signing, then once more for peace of mind. On the first morning there, I unpacked my blue scarf and placed it on the back of a chair. I set my husband's photograph on the windowsill. I brewed coffee and listened to the hum of the kettle, realizing how long it had been since I'd made a choice without checking whether it inconvenienced someone else. My days found a new rhythm. I walked to the market instead of driving. I learned the names of my neighbors slowly, one greeting at a time. I volunteered twice a week at the local library, repairing spines and sorting donations. No one rushed me. No one spoke over me. I was simply another pair of capable hands, and that felt like a gift. The fear did not vanish all at once. Some nights I woke expecting to hear footsteps outside my door, or a voice telling me what was best for me. But the quiet held. Over time, my shoulders relaxed. My breath deepened. I stopped flinching at the sound of a phone notification. Ellen visited often, though never unannounced. She asked before rearranging anything. When she offered help, she waited for my answer. We learned each other again, not as parent and child locked in old patterns, but as two women who respected boundaries. I opened a new notebook and began keeping records again, not out of suspicion, but out of habit and pride. Dates, receipts, small observations about the world. The act grounded me. It reminded me that attention is a form of care. Occasionally, news from my son reached me through others. Struggles, adjustments, silence. I wished him well without reopening doors that had closed for good reason. Distance, I learned, can be an act of love toward oneself. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with my coffee warming my hands, I realized something simple and profound. No one in this home was waiting for me to disappear. I was not being managed. I was not being prepared for removal. I was simply living. Balance returned quietly. Not as forgiveness, not as forgetting, but as steadiness. I had space again, physical space, mental space, moral space. And in that space, I found myself intact. For the first time in a long while, I belonged fully to my own life. You know, when everything finally grew quiet, I expected relief to feel larger than it did. Instead, it felt clean. Like a cleared table after a long meal. I was no longer bracing myself. I was no longer explaining my presence. I woke each morning knowing no one was counting on my confusion or silence. I do not pretend this ending is perfect. There are days I still grieve the family I believed I had. That grief is real, and I let it sit with me without judgment. But it no longer decides my future. I do. What I learned is simple, and it took me a lifetime to learn it. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. Help that takes your voice is not help. And patience, when it is used against you, becomes a kind of harm. I am not angry now. Anger burns hot and fast. What I carry instead is clarity. It is quieter, but it lasts. I sign my own papers. I lock my own doors. I choose who sits at my table. If you are listening to this and something in you tightened, trust that feeling. Pay attention to the small things. The missing mail. The softened explanations. The way your name is spoken when you are not in the room. Those details matter. I am no longer a victim. I am a woman who endured, who noticed, who chose herself without cruelty and without apology. And if this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Stay with me. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling the truths that turn silence into strength together.